I think we're live. Let me see here. We're trying to go live. We should be live. I'm waiting for YouTube to come on here. We're live. Hello. Welcome to another edition of Jazz Video Guy Live. My name is Brett Premack. All the technical difficulties have been worked out here. It's Friday, November 13th. Friday the 13th. I don't know if you believe in that. I don't. But another edition of Jazz Video Guy Live. Today we're featuring a guy that I guess could best be described as a Renaissance man, Ben Sidran. Ben is a musician, a producer, an author. He's been on the radio. He's been on TV. He's written books. He's a father. He's a husband. He lives in Wisconsin. He's Jewish. And he's done a lot in his life. You know, some really interesting stories, some incredible people that he's worked with. But before we bring on Ben, let's check out a little bit of Ben's music.
When I was a young man, just getting started, I didn't even have me a ride into town. I asked my heroes out on the corner. I said, now brother, where'd you get that sound? And one by one, the old men told me about what they'd done, and sometimes how. Well, step on up, take yourself a number, yeah, and take a look at who's the old guy now. Talking about back in the old days, just getting started. I didn't even have me a story to tell. Now that I'm older, I got my own story, but it's the way how I tell it make the damn thing sell. Make it sell. I've been looking back at all my adventures, and I'm getting to wondering if there's a point somehow. I'm looking for answers, coming up with nothing but questions. We'll take a look at who's the old guy now. Who's the old guy now? 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 Old guy now.
How did we get to be the old guys, Ben? What happened?
I don't know, man. We woke up one morning and we looked in the mirror. You know, I once had a conversation back when I was on the radio with Sonny Rollins, man. I'm sorry, with God. See, now I'm proving I'm the old guy. With Gil Evans, he came into the studio. He's wearing jeans and a T-shirt. He's acting like he's 17 years old. He took a hit on his pipe. He sat down. He got in front of the microphone. I said, "Man, you look great." He said, "You know, I feel great except when I look in the mirror." And then I don't know what happened. And I thought, gee, that's odd. That's not odd at all, man. That's waiting for everybody.
Yeah, this is life, you know. You can't avoid this stage. I mean, you have to dig each part of the journey. You know, our culture is very focused on the destination, what I can achieve, what I'm going to do. Really, what it's about is, it's kind of like you're at the bottom of a mountain. You look up the top and you say, I really want to get there. How the hell am I going to get there? Just one step at a time and digging each part of the journey.
Yeah, well, truer words, man. I mean, that's absolutely right. And every moment is the same moment. It's not like any moment is any different. This is it. This is what it feels like. I had a professor in college who used to say, this is what history feels like. You want to know what it felt like in the French Revolution? This is what it felt like. This is what history feels like. And honestly, man, when I was a kid, I looked forward to being older. I thought to myself, you know, it's only going to get more interesting. And by God, it has gotten more interesting.
Yeah, the Chinese have a proverb, may you live in interesting times. And I think that's certainly not true. Well, we want to acknowledge our viewers here. We have Charles from Glasgow. We have Answers Questioned from the Netherlands. And then a fellow with the same name as you, Leo Sidran. Are you related to this man?
My man, that was him in the video. You know, that's me and him in a recording studio. That's what we do together.
Wow.
Of course, he plays everything that needs to be played, and I just play piano and hang out. It's kind of he's my support system in the production of these days.
Well, Leo was, as we were talking about before, was lucky that he grew up in your world, which was a world of creativity and the cats and just everything that went along with that. You grew up in Racine, Wisconsin. Was it a musical household, man?
Not at all. No, not at all. My father liked jazz, and he had a good ear, and he played clarinet now and then, but there was no, I discovered a recording. I discovered Night Train. You remember that old Jimmy Forrest?
Jimmy Forrest.
I discovered Night Train when I was like 6 years old at some school function, and it just blew my brains. I couldn't believe how great it sounded. And at that moment, I knew that whatever that was, I wanted to follow it. And it was totally personal. God knows where it came from. I can't tell you.
Did you hear it on the radio? Did a friend play it on a record player?
I heard it. No, on Saturdays, I went to this art class at a museum. And one Saturday morning, the teacher had us little kids there with our papers and whatever. And she put on this record. Don't know why. Can't imagine. But there it was, Jimmy Forrest Night Train. And I was just stunned. And then later, maybe a year or two later, I have a sister. She's a year older than I am. And she was taking piano lessons. And I used to go along to the piano lessons with her and just sit there and wait. And she quit taking the lessons, and I, started fooling around on the piano. I was never a particularly good student, but I just loved it. There's something, the romance. It's romance, man. This music is all about falling in love. I fell in love. And that's it. Your first love is the strongest. And for me, it was this music.
Absolutely. And what about your entry into the world of jazz? I mean, Jimmy Forrest is a great tenor player who can play a lot of stuff. But in terms of what were some of the first jazz recordings you heard?
Well, Out and Out Jazz was a Horace Silver record. When I was 13, somebody gave me it was either Silver Serenade or it was possibly Six Pieces of Silver. One of those early records with Blue Mitchell and
Junior Cook.
and Matt and Junior Cook. And something about Blue Mitchell. I mean, this was the oddest thing. I remember specifically listening to the song Juicy Lucy, right, with that great Blue Mitchell solo in it, and playing it over and over again and trying to understand it. I don't even know what that meant to understand it, but it was like listening to a language that people were speaking on the other side of a wall. And I didn't have a textbook or anything. I was just listening to it over and over again, trying to understand this language. Specifically that record, man, Juicy Lucy with Horace Silver and Blue Mitchell and Junior Cook.
Yeah, I also, one of my first recordings was Horace Silver's Song for My Father.
Oh, yeah. Well, you must be younger than me.
I'm I'm only 71.
Yeah, well, that explains it, man.
But there was something very welcoming about Horace's compositions, because this was like in the mid 60s. And, you know, I got my information from Downbeat magazine and from jazz DJs and from the guy in the record store who said, hey, check this out, check that out.
Right.
And
right.
If you remember at that time, there was like this, I guess it was controversy, the avant-garde and Coltrane and Ornette. And, you know, when I first came into the music, I just didn't hear that. You know, I mean, it just didn't speak to me. But Horace, you know, immediately I get into that.
See, I was lucky in that I'm old enough that when I was listening, so when I was 13, I got this Horace Silver record for my bar mitzvah from an uncle. That tells me how old I was. But at the time, a few years later, man, Ray Charles was on the radio, and that was jazz. That was a crossover to jazz, and all the jazz that was kind of being played at the time was what you're talking about, very welcoming, very open, you know, the Miles Davis cooking, working, you know, that series, and kind of blue, man. I mean, you hear that record, or Mingus's Mingus some of the things that were just coming out at that period turned out to be some of the greatest examples of this kind of, well, they called it everything. They called it soul jazz. They called it hard bop. They had all these different names for it, but basically it was swinging, good time, anybody can get with it jazz.
So you went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. You live in Madison now and have since then.
Yeah.
What was the Ardels?
Okay. So here I am at the University of Wisconsin in 1961. And back then, you know, we were listening to Cannonball Adderley live in San Francisco, and, you know, we wanted to play those songs. And I had a little trio. I actually worked my way through my bachelor degree playing gigs. And when you think about it today, people are graduating with $100,000 in debt. Back then, tuition was $150 a semester. Rent was $50 a month. And I was playing 3 or 4 gigs a week and making like $35. So I was literally able to work my way through college. And at one point, I was driving my little Vespa motor scooter down Fraternity Row, and I heard a band. They were set up over by the lake, and I pulled my Vespa motor scooter up to the stage, and I'm sitting there listening to them. And man, they sounded good. They sang great, but they were playing this kind of Texas blues that wasn't that different from Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and it wasn't that different from Ray Charles. And at the end of the gig, I went up to the guys, and they didn't have a piano player. I went up to them, we started talking, and I weaseled my way into the band. The band was called the Ardels, and the leader was Steve Miller, and the bass player was Boz Scaggs, and there was a drummer who was the manager of a hamburger stand, and another guitar player who was a frat brother of Steve's, great musician named Denny Berg. And for a year or so, I rode in the van with the Ardels and played piano with them. And I learned a lot about Jimmy Reed, T-Bone Walker. I discovered the radio station out of Nashville, WLAC. It was an education, and it fit right in with that jazz we're talking about, that groove jazz.
Yeah. Well, Boz and Steve, of course, went on to record some wonderful albums, and they both have very interesting careers. But unbeknownst to me, I first heard you on the Steve Miller record, Children of the Future. You played the harpsichord on Baby's Coming Home. How did that happen?
See, that's my first time in a recording studio. That was interesting. That was 1967. Uh, I had gone to graduate school in England at the University of Sussex in Brighton. The year before that, 66, Miller had moved to Chicago and was playing at Big John's and the blues clubs. And I was kind of going down there and hanging out a little bit. And then Steve moved to San Francisco and he called me up or sent me a letter. He said, man, you got to come out here. This scene is exploding. And most of these musicians don't know how to play. You know, we're talking about how rough it was out there. People would pick up a guitar and be a guitar player. But we had all this repertoire behind us. He said, you got to come out here. And genius that I was, I said to him, no, man, I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going on to graduate school. So I went to graduate school. Steve, in 1967, played Monterey, got a record contract, and as fate would have it, came to London to record his first record. And so I was going to college in Brighton, which is an hour away from London by train. So during the day, I would go to school, and at night, I would jump on the train and go up to London and hang at Olympic Studios with Steve and Boz and a wonderful producer engineer named Glyn Johns. And one night, I think it was in December of 67, I remember specifically everybody had gone home. It was probably midnight or 1 o'clock, except Boz and me and Glyn. And we were sitting there, and Boz had a 12 string and he was playing this song, or maybe it was a 6 string, I don't remember, but it was Baby's Calling Me Home. And there's nobody there but me and him. And Glyn looked out into the studio and saw this harpsichord and said to me, hey, can you play harpsichord? And I never touched a harpsichord. But I said, of course I can play harpsichord. I'm one of the great harpsichord players in town. So he pushed it out into the room, put a mic on it, and Boz and I sat in the studio and recorded that song just as you hear it. Then he doubled the vocal, and that's how that happened, and that was my first recording.
Well, I love that recording at that time. I think it was really, I don't want to say it was Steve Miller's Sgt Pepper, but it came out around that time. There's a lot of different kinds of music on there, but definitely solidly based in the blues.
Yeah, that was when Steve, he came out of San Francisco, but he was basically, from Texas. He was a blues guitar player. But he was right on the cutting edge of that psychedelic stuff. And he definitely wanted to be part of the narrative of the times, whatever the narrative was. If the narrative was, Steve was never political, for example. But when politics became necessary, he got involved in politics. But his real roots are in the blues. What he does best is play blues guitar.
Yeah. And could you say a few words, as long as we're doing the nostalgia thing? Where was Boz at that time? You see, when you first played with him in the Ardels, he was playing bass. When did he switch to the guitar, and what was the world like collaborating with him?
Yeah, Boz is a sweetheart, man. Boz is a gentleman and a scholar in the sense that he's very serious about what he does. And he got to Madison because Miller was here. He was a guitar player, but Miller needed a bass player, so Boz became a bass player. But soon after that, when Miller went to San Francisco, Boz went to Europe. And he cut his first record in Sweden. It was a solo record. He played on the street. He slept under the bridges in Paris. He wandered through India. He let his hair grow long. He was really down. He was not into the commerce of the music business at all. He was a searcher, which is strange when you think about his big hit was, a Lowdown, which is Boz in a white coat, like Saturday Night Fever playing disco. But that's not who Boz was or who he is today. His roots are very deep. And so playing with Boz and hanging with Boz has always been wonderful. Just on a human level and on a music level. He's all music. He He digs up. He once said in an interview or something somewhere that I showed him what a major seventh chord was, which is interesting because for Boz, that was an opening. All he knew at that point was the dominant seventh chord. He didn't play the major seven. So that was like a jazz moment for Boz.
Yeah. So after you finished school, did you stay over there? Did you do any session work?
Yeah, well, while I was in school, Steve and all those cats went back to San Francisco, and I had 2 more years. I was in a PhD program, so I was there for another 2 years. And Glyn Johns became just more and more famous by the week as the engineer, the producer of The Who, of the Rolling Stones, eventually of the Beatles, Small Faces. Glyn became the go-to guy. And, the first record he produced was the Miller record. So I met Glyn before his career really blew up, although he had done the Stones, and I think the Who right around that time. But anyway, we would my wife Judy and I would pal around with Glyn. We'd drive up and hang out with Glyn. I mean, he became a pal. And from time to time, he would call me up and get me to come up to Olympic to play on sessions. And of course, the most astonishing session was when he literally called me up on a Thursday and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I don't know why." He said, "Come on up here. I want you to play piano on the session I'm doing. And by the way, on the way into town, can you stop and pick up the drummer?" I was living in Brighton. I had a car by then. The drummer lived just up the road, and he didn't drive. So I did. And I picked up Charlie Watts. I stopped at the door of this huge Tudor house and knocked on it. And it was opened by that famous face, Charlie Watts. There was a big fire going in the fireplace. And in the background, he was listening to a Miles Davis record. I introduced myself and I said, "Hey, Charlie, man, it's great to meet you. I'm so glad to hear you listening to Miles." I said, "I got to be honest with you, man. I don't listen to the Stones a lot." He said, "That's all right, mate. Neither do we." And we got in the car and drove to London. We had this great conversation about drummers. I remember specifically Big Sid Catlett was somebody we were talking about. And we got to the studio. We got to Olympic Studios. We went in. There was Mick Jagger sitting at the piano, and he was playing kind of a really nice, kind of sounded like a ballad. Charlie introduced me. I said, "Hey, Mick, is that the song that's being recorded tonight?" He said, "Oh, no, mate, it's just something I'm fooling around with." And then for the next 6 hours, we hammered away at 3 major triads. And that was the session. I don't really recall anything about it other than there I was in a line set up. It was, for some reason, Glyn set it up in a line with the Rolling Stones playing a Little Wurlitzer piano. So that was the most memorable one in the sense that it was the Rolling Stones. But there were other sessions, Charlie and I and Peter Frampton did some kind of jazzy blues sessions and various, we hung. Yeah. Back then it was a very open scene, This is interesting, man, because I'm sure you find this. Every scene has a moment. There was a moment in England in 1967. It was just about to happen. And everybody was hanging out with everybody and trading stories. So Eric Clapton would be in one room and The Who would be in another room. And you'd all meet up in the kitchen and somebody would have a guitar and be talking about the Meters or New Orleans or, it was before the star thing. It was before the business made millionaires and assholes out of virtually everybody, because that's what money does. But these scenes happen. I mean, I remember in Minneapolis in the mid-'80s, middle of northern USA, the scene was just like that. Very friendly, people hanging. LA was like that in the early 70s. The music that we love and that we play and we listen to was all made in these little hot pots around the world by a handful of people. And then, of course, it expanded and the business blew it up and took it around the world. But originally, this stuff was very personal and very small.
Yeah, another aspect of the music at that time, before it became like a big deal, a big business thing, there was like an acceptance. Like there was a radio station in New York, WABC-FM. Michael Cascuna was the DJ. He was playing Coltrane and Frank Zappa, and that went on for a little while. Then it became very segmented. But there was something magical in the air back then.
That's Radio Free, the Radio Free radio format that Tom, what's his name, out of San Francisco, started. It for a while, that's what it was. They would play Aretha Franklin, and then they'd play Jackie McLean, and then they'd play T-Bone Walker, and then they'd play the Small Faces, and then they'd play. That was the whole idea.
Yeah.
Radio Free, the Radio Free format.
And how did you get into radio? That's actually my first knowledge of you, when you were on NPR. How did you get into that?
Michael Cascuna. Michael Cascuna recommended me to the producer of Jazz Alive in the late 70s. NPR started, got a bunch of money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to do programming, and a big part of it was jazz. And at the time, jazz was dead, man. I mean, there were no jazz gigs in the early 70s. Jazz wasn't being played on commercial radio by and large. So NPR became the home for jazz. And there was a show called Jazz Alive that Billy Taylor was the host. And it was on 280 stations around the United States, and it would broadcast live gigs from everywhere. And the way they did that is local stations would send tapes in. And Tim Owens, who was the producer of the show, was looking for somebody to replace Billy Taylor. Billy was going to go to CBS and do that Sunday morning gig. So I think part of the reason I got the chance to do it was because, first of all, Billy was a piano player and I'm a piano player. Second of all, he was Dr. Billy Taylor. And of course, I had a PhD, and I think it was helpful to NPR to have the academic front to maintain the respectability for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I don't know that for a fact, but I suspect that was part of the reason. But the bottom line was I was hired to do the New Year's Eve show. Either it was 1979 or 1980. And I was just thrown in, man. It was done across the country, different time zones. Billy Taylor, I believe, was in Chicago. Somebody else was in Denver. Somebody else was in San Francisco, I suppose. And I was in New York. I had no training on the radio, but I had a lot of experience on the microphone, being somebody who had by then toured for 10 years and had been talking to audiences. And so I remember we were set up, and in New York, the first band was the Brecker Brothers. And I had the headphones on, and the producer said, "Okay, Ben, go, you're on." And I remember turning and talking to Michael Brecker, and we just started chatting. And the next thing I knew, there was a party going on in my headphones across the country. It was fantastic. I didn't have any sense of being on the radio. I really thought of it as hanging. I was hanging with the cats, who I've always had a hang with. So that's how I got the job.
Well, there's something that you and Billy share, and that's that, for lack of a better describe it, you have a way of demystifying the musicians. You have a way of like bringing us into the room. Was that something that came naturally to you?
Yeah, I'm sure it was. Because back when I was listening to Blue Mitchell on the Horace Silver record, I literally thought to myself that we were related. There was something about the music that was like family. There was something very social about this world, and I really wanted to be in this world. And when I got in the world, especially when I got into radio, this idea of demystifying, I'm sure, came to me because of Billy Taylor and Marion McPartland and these piano players who did National Public Radio. And that's what they did. They talked to musicians as if they were people, as opposed to as if they were like odd ducks who just happened to have this this gift. And I used to say, man, jazz musicians are just like the rest of us, only more so. I had the feeling that, to be able to play, for example, like Stanley Turrentine, or to be able to play like any of these cats, it didn't matter who, Sonny Clark, you had to have great human depth. This music is hard to play, man. Everybody, Dizzy Gillespie made a whole point out of how hard this music, it's hard music. But the people who play it were not academics back then, So to be able to master this language and not be an academic or in the world of academics was fascinating, because it really spoke to the humanity of the music. It spoke to the fact that it could be learned. It probably couldn't be taught, but it could be learned. And what it was doing, it was a grammar that was talking about, the fact that we all shared more than we knew, that the music talked about community. And it was pre-political, it was pre-academic, it was very human, and everybody was playing the music because they had no choice. It was before there was money in the music. In jazz, there was no money in jazz until, headhunters came along, or George Benson. But before that, it was just gigs. You traveled across the country playing gigs. And that life, as Phil Woods pointed out, was like where history existed on the bus. And he used to say that musicians were warriors. That was Phil's word. They were warriors. And he would talk about Pepper Adams as being a jazz man down to his socks. Can you imagine somebody riding a bus with sweaty feet and funky socks? You got a sense. Or Miles said, your style is like your sweat. There was something about it that was just interior, ingrained. And that's exactly, not the funky socks, but that's what I was interested in, demystifying what jazz was about. I thought jazz was a language.
Yeah. Another aspect, you mentioned the community. I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut. My dad was a musician. I heard a lot of jazz live. But when I moved to New York in '68 to go to NYU Film School, I started hanging out in the kitchen of the Vanguard. And I had listened to these musicians, for a while. But this was my first experience being around them. And it was just beautiful, the way these guys talked to each other, the humor, the sharing of the music. I mean, that was a community that to this day, I think, is one of the things that makes this music very unique.
How did you know enough to walk into the kitchen? That's amazing.
I was just on my way to the bathroom. Instead of going left, I turned right, and somebody was laughing back there, and I just went in. And initially, I just became a fly on the wall. I mean, I just listened to these people.
Yeah.
And I must admit, when I was a kid, these jazz musicians were like gods to me. But I went to New York and I hung out at the Vanguard, and I found out they're just mere mortals. I mean, so I don't know if this is the place, but sometimes I have to tell my Jimmy Smith story.
Oh, I can imagine.
Where I was doing some liner notes with him, and I don't know he was drunk. He was an alcoholic. And he got to the point where he said to me he wanted to castrate me and barbecue it and feed it back to me.
You got that's the real deal, man.
Yeah.
That's the real deal.
So I learned to separate the man from the music. I mean, there's two different things.
That's exactly right. It's one of the great mysteries of this music is how can somebody who's an evil junkie play the most beautiful music you could ever hear? How is this possible? Because we assume when we hear somebody playing beautifully that they're expressing the essence of their soul. And maybe they are, but maybe the soul is so multifaceted that what they've done is they've learned to access a certain room in a very complicated architecture. And it happens over and over again. But so many of these cats were and are beautiful, beautiful human beings.
Oh, yeah.
Not all of them.
No.
Not all of them. But that humanity really came out.
Yeah.
And the generosity, man, that you must have witnessed in the kitchen. That's it. The humor and the generosity. You know, anytime I played and had a good night, somebody was generous and said, "Man, you sounded good tonight." You know, that kind of encouragement is how people learn to play. Nobody really was telling you, "Man, on the fourth bar of the bridge, you should play this substitution." Nobody said that. And Red Rodney once told me about playing with Charlie Parker, that Charlie Parker never told anybody anything. He'd look at him, face him with the horn, and play something. And Red said, and if you didn't get it the next time around, he'd play it again and really look at you. And the third time, you were off the gig. I mean, that's how this music got passed on from sideman to sideman, as they say.
Yeah. We've got a couple of comments here from Jerry Hilton. My first knowledge of Ben was in the Nitty Gritty. And then she adds, Jeannie Cheatham says to say hello.
Ah, interesting.
Who's Jeannie Cheatham?
She was married to Doc Cheatham. Jeannie's a really fine piano player and singer. I think she's moved to Santa Barbara or San Diego. And Jimmy got the gig being the professor of the Black Music program here at the University of Wisconsin. And Jeannie and Jimmy had a regular gig, very popular gig, where they schooled a lot of musicians. A lot of musicians learned what they learned coming through and sitting in, not at the school, but sitting in on the gig. And the Nitty Gritty was a blues club. So when I moved back to Madison after living in LA in the early 70s, of course, by then being a bebop fan, but also a blues fan because of the Steve Miller stuff, I started playing at this little blues club called the Nitty Gritty with a guy named Curly Cook, who was also one of Steve Miller's early teachers / students. And the Nitty Gritty was a great scene. It was a great blues scene. And that's where the great drummer Clyde Stubblefield, who is known as the funky drummer because he played with James Brown for so many years. So Clyde's brother lived in Madison. And when Clyde finally had the big blow-up fight with James Brown, he was in Madison. So he just told James he quit, and he moved to Madison. So we were playing at the Nitty Gritty with James Brown's drummer. It was just unbelievable.
Yeah. Clyde Stubblefield's one of the most sampled drummers around. I mean, the beats that he laid down for James Brown are absolutely incredible. Before we leave the radio part of the discussion, what's your take on the radio scene today? There really aren't very many jazz stations left on broadcast, certainly Sirius XM on satellite, but there's a lot of smaller stations. I mean, we're going to maybe look at a video that you did of a jazz station over in France. What is your take on jazz on the radio today?
Well, the great thing about jazz radio and the way radio used to be part of the jazz life, you know, back in the early days of Symphony Sid or whoever, these guys would hold your hand through the night. It's the image of Donald Fagen's Nightfly. You know, that was true. That was a real guy. He was there and he played music for you, and his voice got you through difficult times. That was the root of jazz radio originally. And then, you know, I mean, obviously all the radio stations got bought up by Clear Channel eventually and whatever. For a while, NPR was the pipeline for jazz. Today, you're absolutely right. It's either Mark Ruffin doing Sirius XM jazz, real jazz, channel 67. That's not a plug. That's just a thank you. And then there are these local stations. I mean, there's still a good station in near San Diego. There's, of course, WBGO in New York. There are a few that have survived, but mostly, if it's not college radio, it's you know, some other. And of course, the heartbreak is that they tend often not to have long-term relationships with on-air personalities. And it's those relationships that made young people's connection to the music personal. I used to say about jazz, how do people say, well, jazz, I don't understand it. It's too complicated. How can I get into it? I used to say, listen to Kind of Blue. Anybody can dig Kind of Blue. And if you dig it, look on the back of the record and see who's on it. Oh, there's a guy named John Coltrane. Okay, get a record by him. Oh, there's a guy named Cannonball Adderley. Get a record by him. And then if you like that, you turn it over and you go, oh, Cannonball Adderley. Oh, there's a guy named Bobby Timmons. Get a record by. So jazz used to be a personal wandering through the forest of this music. Everybody's path was different. But the DJ on the radio station was the guy. If there was a guy, he was the guy that would lead you through this path. Today, that whole thing does not exist. The problem is the illusion of plenty, the delusion of plenty. Everything is on Spotify. Everything is on the internet. How do you find your own way through that? It's not like turning over a record and seeing half a dozen names. How do you find your jazz? How do you find the jazz that speaks to you, that can get you through the ultimate difficult night? And that's what jazz radio should do. And that's what it doesn't have the infrastructure to do anymore. So if you ask me about what do I think about jazz radio, I think it's a brave outpost now, but it's not in the heart of the jazz experience, I don't think.
No, it's not. It's sad because one thing you mentioned, this cross-pollination of hearing artists on a particular album. In those days, when we were young, they would identify the personnel on the record. They'd say, well, Horace Silver on piano, Gene Taylor on bass, Louis Hayes on drums, Bill Mitchell on trumpet, and Junior Cook on sax. Now you don't get that. It's easy to find that on the internet. You hear a track, oh, who was that? All music, you get all the information. But still, that personalization factor, that's gone now. I miss that.
Right. The intercession, the intermediation of somebody who you like and you trust giving you some information is key. How else do you learn anything? You don't learn anything in college by memorizing a book and passing a test. You learn it if you're lucky enough to get next to a really great teacher. And that intermediation in something as complicated as jazz, I mean, really, this is a very complicated music we're talking about. And at the same time, back then it was Tuesday night at a club in your town. That was the amazing thing about jazz. It was a street experience elevated to a high art. It was a wildflower that grew up through the concrete by itself. It was all these things that spoke about community in America, man. It was a very American experience in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And it blew the minds of people around the world because of the humanity that was inherent in it. And, the radio, well, radio doesn't exist. Now it's internet or satellite. That local guy, man, that's a dream, of course. That's what Donald Fagen did with the Nightfly. He lived out his dream of being that guy in the middle of the night, smoking cigarette after cigarette and playing Jackie McLean and, Bobby Timmons. That's a dream that we all had back then.
Yeah. Our viewer, Ann Reynolds comments, we still need liner notes. That's another thing that's disappeared, on Spotify or YouTube, wherever you get the music, no liner notes.
Well, CDs kind of put the stake in the heart of liner notes because designers who didn't read liner notes thought that this type size didn't matter. It was just part of the design. And so when they started designing CDs and they had all this copy, people were still thinking liner notes, right? You couldn't read it. It was too small. It was part of the design package. Jazz, the guy who really started the jazz record thing was Alfred Lyon at Blue Note. He was the first guy to put a black musician's picture on the cover of the record. Up until then, they thought, well, if you put a black person on the cover, nobody will buy it. They would put designs. Alfred Lyons said, no. This is a true artifact of a true art form, and we're going to put it up. But liner notes is, Leonard Feather, Ira Gittler, these guys taught a lot of young people about the music. Of course, now everything's online. I mean, you can find it, but it's a different thing going online and Googling something and having this piece of cardboard in your hands as you're listening to the music, because it's connected. This cardboard is something you had to go out and pay money for and bring home and look at it. I remember once here in Madison, a record store burned down, huge fire, right? And the fire company came in with the hoses, and if the fire didn't burn it up, the hoses soaked everything. So there was literally a fire sale at the record store. And I remember going through all these soaked records and finding these soaked jazz records for, like a dime or something. And I had these records in my collection, man, from the fire sale. Jazz records were artifacts of a living experience, man. That's what they were.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump over to television, where you did a great show on VH1 called New Visions. Can you share with us how that happened? And I mean, for some reason, the one that really jumps out at me was with the World Saxophone Quartet. Yeah. But you did a lot of them. How long was that show on for? How many shows did you do?
We did hundreds. I was on for 3 years, and of course, it was on every Sunday. And every Sunday, we'd have, I think, 2 or 3 artists, didn't we? I don't know. But we taped the show over, we taped 3 shows on an afternoon. Maybe they'd be shown different Sunday nights. I guess that's the way it was. But the green room experience, like it could be Robert Cray and Wynton Marsalis and David Byrne in the green room waiting to do their thing. And of course, they were all being entertained by the young 21-year-old blonde intern who was there in the green room doing intern stuff. I mean, it was a very great scene in the green room. The scene on the set, however, was a little stiff because it was a set. Jazz doesn't do well on a set. That's just a fact. There's living videos now of Cannonball, particularly out of Sweden and out of a lot of European countries, where they would actually integrate jazz musicians into their cultural programming. And there would be sets, or Coltrane even. And when you look at this, it was just weird. Nobody knew what to do with jazz. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know, should we focus on the fingers of the saxophone? Is that something to look at? Not really. That doesn't tell you anything. Should we do something really arty with the shadows? Well, the thing about the New Visions program, and this is almost always true with jazz, is that there's always adversity. Nobody gives you enough money to do anything. It's jazz. Nobody watches. Who cares? We were on Sunday night. We had no technical ratings. I mean, VH1 just totally left us alone because they thought nobody was watching. And so we could do anything, say anything pretty much, as long as we were on the set and it looked kind of like what they wanted. So I was, I guess, technically a VJ. I shared a dressing room with Rosie O'Donnell. She had all her clothes lined up, and I had my 2 sport coats at the end of the rack, Technically, we were like the stepchild of video. So it was fantastic. And I was pushing over and over to get them to put the show in the green room, put cameras in the green room. That's where the show is, But we'd go on the set and they'd say, okay, Ben, you go out and introduce the World Saxophone Quartet. I mean, you got 2 minutes. So unlike radio where you had an hour, you know, the best thing we could do is just bring the greatest cats in the world onto this set and turn them loose. And sometimes I was able, to crack them up or tell a story. I remember the night we had Sun Ra on. And so, the music had to be in 6-minute segments, 8-minute segments. Well, Sun Ra started playing, and I'm hearing in my earphones, okay, give him a sign. Tell him to wrap it up. How'd you like to give Sun Ra a sign to wrap it up? And I told the director, I'm sorry, man, there is no sign. This is not going to get wrapped up. So they went to a commercial break, and they came out back. Sun Ra's still playing, It was pretty funny. But it meant a lot to a lot of people, having a weekly jazz program with me, your host, not technically being prepared, just being there, just talking. I mean, like if they had 2 minutes to fill, they would literally say to me, Ben, fill 2 minutes. And I'd start talking just like the jazz musician would start playing. And that was the vibe of the show. The show was so successful that it killed itself. And here's how it's killed itself. It won the ACE Award for the best music show on television. And then the people at VH1 noticed what we were doing on Sunday nights at midnight. They went, oh, wait a minute, this show won an award. And so they decided to do New Visions 7 nights a week. They did New Visions reggae, New Visions blues, New Visions punk, who knows, soul. And of course, nobody cared about those shows, and they tanked. And so they went down and they took New Visions jazz with it. So success, as is usually the case, can kill jazz.
You mentioned Sun Ra. Yeah. I am a tremendous Sun Ra fan. And I had an experience with Sun Ra where, let me just put myself back in the space here. I was in New York at the time. I was writing for Downbeat. I was doing an article on the Saturday Night Live band. Howard Shore was leading the band at that time. And somehow he was able to get Sun Ra booked on Saturday Night Live. So I was at the dress rehearsal that Saturday afternoon. And, Sun Ra came out. And the network executives were there on the floor. I was right next to him. Sun Ra came out. They totally flipped out. I mean, they couldn't believe it. As it turns out, they put him on at the end of the show, which was about 10 to 1 at the time. So then, of
course,
not long after that, I actually interviewed Sun Ra. This was an article for Downbeat. I asked Sun Ra one question. He talked nonstop for 6 hours.
6 hours? Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, see, that's it. On New Visions, we would let the bass player take a solo. When's the last time you saw a bass solo on television? But that's why jazz was never successful on television. People don't know and plus, quite frankly, it loses its texture. Jazz is not a visual medium. Sun Ra as an exception, or Roland Kirk as an exception. Jazz is not visual. There's one video out there of Charlie Parker playing, and he doesn't move at all. He stands like this. His fingers, makes a movement, and it's the greatest thing. It's a tsunami of soul and hipness, but visually there's nothing going on. Jazz, by and large, is not welcomed by the visual mediums. And that's an interesting issue now today with young people who never saw that other stuff or felt that other stuff. And they're all integrating new video techniques into jazz, which sometimes work. Sometimes are pretty cool. We didn't have them back in that day. There were none. They would overlight the set, for example. They would, I'm sure it's happened on Saturday Night Live, they would bathe the set in light because they needed light for the cameras. Well, then finally a guy actually named Stanley Dorfman out of England said, what happens if you don't have all those lights? And they cut the lights down and it was cool. But up until then, you had to have stuff that made jazz look cheesy, I guess is the word.
Yeah. We got an interesting comment here from Frankie Sangiovanni. Says, speaking as a former jazz major from America, I wish more students would lose the need to be a working musician and explore their own artistry. So many young people are afraid to write. What's your take on that?
I disagree totally. I think too many young people are writing today, and they don't necessarily have the wisdom to pull it off. I think without gigs, you don't develop style. I think, if you spend 8 hours a day in a practice room, you're going to sound like you're spending your time in a practice room. If you if you're playing on a gig, you'll know right away what people dig and what they don't dig. And I think jazz is a social music. You play it for people who dig it. Or as Johnny Griffin said, you play it for people who have chosen to feel good in spite of conditions. So gigs are crucial to developing a personal style. It's not about artistry so much. It's about finding your own voice. Your goal as a jazz player is, number one, to find your own voice. Number two, to plug into a tradition. You're in a long line of cats, man, who have passed this down. And number three, you're there to, Art Blakey said, your job is to wash away the dust of everyday life. You're to help people. Jazz is emotional, spiritual music. I personally disagree with this whole focus on artistry. I don't know if I'm an artist or not. I don't know if Coltrane was an artist, if he thought of himself as an artist, or if he thought himself as a voice for the people. And these are very different positions. So I in this case, I disagree.
Here's a question from Ronald Secchi. He says, are there any cool stories behind the Song for a Sucker Like You?
Well, it's a very short story. I was in Toronto, Canada at a party. And a young girl came up to me, not a young girl, one young woman, excuse me, and said, why don't you write a song for a sucker like me? Somebody gives you a line like that, there it is. And that's literally how that song got written.
Yeah. Okay. We got that one covered. Let's, we're coming up on the end of the show here. Can you stay another 10 minutes?
Me? Yeah, I'm going nowhere.
Okay, good. So let's talk about your career as a performer. We haven't really gotten into that. What was your first recording, and when did you feel during your career, because you produced other musicians, when did you feel, I got to put my own music out there?
Well, yeah. Well, the first thing was watching Glyn Johns, who we talked about, in the studio. I realized that to be a producer, what you really needed to do is know the music, know how to deal with people, and have an opinion. And so my road to production was based on that. So I moved to LA after attending the university. My goal was to get in the record business, not as an artist specifically, because I was not a singer like Steve and Boz were. And back then it was all about singer-songwriters. If you remember the early 70s, that's what was going on, singer-songwriters. And, but I needed to make a living and pay the rent. And there's an interesting story about how I got into the record business as an artist. I don't necessarily need to share it with you, but it's transformative in that I realized that being an artist in the record business was not about art at all. It was totally about commerce, and I needed to pay the rent. So I found a way to get a recording contract. And I honestly was not a singer-songwriter, but the executive who signed me said, we are only signing singer-songwriters. So if you're going to be an artist, you're going to be a singer-songwriter. So I said, oh, of course I can sing. I never sang in my life until I was making my first recording in 1971 with a $10,000 microphone in my face. So obviously it took me a while to figure out what I was doing. I made 9 records, 1 on Capitol, 3 or 4 on Blue Thumb, 3 or 4 on Arista, 1 on A&M, whatever that amounts to, before I really understood who I was as somebody who went out and traveled and played music and performed in front of people, and what was comfortable for me and natural for me. And I was such an odd duck in the record business during the 70s. I had lots of friends who were great producers, and I would turn to them and say, can you help me? And they would all say, man, I don't know what to do with you, you do it. So that's how I wound up producing myself until, the last 10 years when Leo has been producing my stuff. And my recordings the last 10 years have a real clear, definite sound. But around about 1982, I figured out what my relationship was to jazz, to the record business, and to my own voice. And putting those things together made all the difference. Because up until then, I was making records. And when you make records, what you're doing these days is you're mostly manufacturing something in a more or less sterile environment. Especially today when people are phoning in their part through the internet from all over the world. I mean, you're not in a room together. How intimate is that? But after doing it for 10 years, I figured out. And so that would be about 1981 or 82. And the records I made since then were very personal. Some of them disappeared without a trace. Some of them did very well. But I can stand behind them as the subject of the recording session as opposed to the producer.
Yeah. Now, at that time, that's the old school record business where there were these executives who were all powerful. Tell us about your experience with Clive Davis.
Oh, you had to pick him. Well, Clive thought he was a rock and roll star. That's who Clive was. Clive was a lawyer who fancied himself as a genius of some kind, and his reputation lives on that way. A lot of people think Clive. The only thing that Clive did that caught my attention really was what was that great singer? Whitney Houston. I love what he did with Whitney Houston, but aside from that, I don't know what he was about. So Arista, because he had the label just started. I was like maybe the 3rd or 4th person signed to Clive's label, and he was going to do this jazz thread. So he had the Brecker brothers and myself, and they signed Mulhall Richard Abrams. He obviously was looking for some kind of legitimacy. Why would he get involved in stuff that wasn't necessarily going to sell? At the same time, the label he started was based on Barry Manilow. So he had Barry Manilow. That's how he started. And anyway, I made this recording of a song called Song for a Sucker Like You. And Song for a Sucker Like You was getting airplay, a lot of airplay across the United States, especially down where you live, man, in Phoenix and Tucson. They played that song to death. I was shocked when I went to Phoenix to play this gig in a little club called Chewy's. There's lines out the door, man, because this song got played. So I took a meeting with Clive Davis about my career. And his motto at the time was Arista Records where careers are launched. And so actually at the time, Warner Brothers was really the label that launched careers, not Arista. Anyway, I go into his office. There's Clive Davis. Sitting on an elevated kind of, the desk was higher than the chair you sat in. The window was behind him, so there was glare. You couldn't really see him. And this shadowy figure said, now, Ben, I'd like to talk to you about your career. You've got this record here. It's doing okay. Could do better. Here's what you need to do. He said, you need to call up Boz Scaggs. Boz had just had the hit with Lowdown. He said, you need to call up Boz Scaggs and get on his tour and open for him. And I said, with all due respect, Boz is a friend. If I call him up, I'm going to ask him about his son, and he's going to ask me about my son. Why don't you call up Boz's manager and see if you can get me on his tour? And Clive Davis flipped out. totally flipped out. He banged his hand on the desk. He said, I can't work with somebody like you. You don't want it bad enough. You're not going to make it. There's nothing about you that's going to happen unless you really want it bad enough, and you don't. This meeting is over. And he pushed a button that was underneath his desk, and an assistant came in the door and said, Mr. Davis, your next appointment is here, and escorted me out. And I walked out into the hallway where I met a guy named Steve Backer, who was a great friend and really was the guy who signed me to Arista. And I told him what had just happened. And he said to me something that was as true as anything I've heard in the record business. He said, Ben, don't blame the message on the messenger. And I realized Clive Davis was right. He was a jerk, but he was right. I didn't want it bad enough. That's not who I was. And and I've got other little interactions with Clive, but that was the key one.
Yeah. Now, another old school guy, total opposite, Tommy LaPuma, who you ended up writing a wonderful book about, the Ballad of Tommy LaPuma. Could you share with us something about Tommy?
Well, I met Tommy in 1972 when I signed to the Blue Thumb record label. Tommy was one of the real old school cats. You know, Clive Davis was on the other side of the river. He was on the side where the record business was run by lawyers and accountants. That was his credential. Tommy LaPuma's credential was he came up through publishing, through promotion, as a saxophone player. And when I met Tommy, it was just when Blue Thumb was maybe going to be a successful record label. And Tommy, aside from being a mensch, and aside from being a musician, Tommy had the most tremendous people skills. He could make people want to play their best to please him. He knew how to talk to musicians. He knew why to talk to musicians. He knew what went into making a song work. He very soulful guy who, you know, if it was a reasonable cause and he was behind it all the way. At the same time, he was the most successful jazz record producer in the history of jazz. He sold 80 million records. He produced, the George Benson hit record. He produced the Natalie Cole hit record. But he also produced Little Jimmy Scott. And he also produced very risky records. He produced Horace Silver. He produced Michael Brecker. He produced Danilo Perez. And the Danilo record didn't sell, really, I don't suppose. But the money he made on the big selling records financed a lot of great music. And that's who Tommy was. Tommy was in the business from his heart, not from his pocketbook. And he was a tremendous, the story of Tommy is a tremendous story because it's picaresque. It starts at the ground level with Tommy opening boxes in a warehouse. That's how he got in the record business. To 5 Grammys, man. The last record he produced, really, aside from a Natalie Cole record, a Diana Krall record, was Paul McCartney. He produced Paul McCartney's jazz record. So that's a thumbnail sketch of who Tommy was. And then if you're interested, there's the Ballad of Tommy LaPuma, which tells all the details.
Yeah, that was a really good book. You've written a number of good books, my friend. And one that we talked about recently was There Was a Fire, Jews, Music, and the American Dream, which I highly recommend. In fact, on YouTube, there are a number of talks that Ben did where he discusses the book. How did you decide to become an author and add to your arsenal of creativity?
Well, the first book that was published was my PhD dissertation, which is still in print. It's called Black Talk. It was published in 1971, and it's a sociological look at the history of jazz through a filter of communication theory, and it was very much a post-60s book, a revolutionary book in a way. It was the first book that looked at jazz music as an extension of an oral tradition. But I didn't write it as a book. I wrote it to get out of the University of Sussex. The second book was called Talking Jazz, and it was a series of interviews that I did transcribed. Miles and Sonny and Art, Max, all these cats. The second book. The first book I really wrote as a book was a biography, an autobiography called A Life in the Music, the true story of everything I ever knew. And I wrote that book when I was like 57 because my heart failed. And I had always wanted to tell these stories that I had been privy to. A lot of great things went down in front of me from 1966 to 2000 when that book came out. And I took notes because I was a student. I was a college student my whole life. I'm somebody who never really graduated. I got degrees, but I'm still in school. And I had saved all these notes. And I had tried to write this book, and it was terrible. I didn't know how to write it. I didn't know how to write. Really, what is writing? You sit down, and there's a blank paper in front of you, and what do you do? But when I was diagnosed with this heart condition, which was potentially fatal, and then it was fixed, somehow the book came to me. And I wrote that book, and I loved the process, the experience of sitting alone in a room and doing this. So that's really how I became a writer. And then the next book was There Was a Fire, Jews, Music, and the American Dream, where I was able to marry my interest in history and sociology and communication theory with my curiosity of where the Jews fit into the story of popular music in America, not simply a jazz, which was an interest of mine, but into this whole tradition of social justice that the Jews have carried on, the concept of tikkun olam, to heal the world, a very Jewish concept. But the idea of social justice, where did that come from? How did the Jews stumble upon that? Why was that important? Who are the Jews? Who were the Jews when they came to America? There's an expression. The Jews were searching for America, but America was also searching for the Jews. And, the Jews had never been more than 2% of the population of the United States or the world. There are a billion Christians, a billion Muslims. There are 15 million Jews. That's it. So I thought, boy, there's something going on, and I wanted to look into it. And so that book, There Was a Fire, is the book I'm most proud of. Although the most fun book to read would be the Ballad of Tommy LaPuma. You can read it in 6 hours, and it's a great. If you got a 6-hour flight, read that book.
Yeah.
The Jewish book will take you longer.
Here's a comment from Ben Blues. He says, "Hey Ben, it's your tenor player in Copenhagen. As always, you are a great storyteller." Another
Wonderful.
person.
Another storyteller. The Copenhagen tenor player is Bob Rockwell. He's still there. He's still playing. He's an American tenor player who expatriated in the 80s, I guess. 80s. Fantastic cat. A bebopper down to his socks. Wonderful friend. We're still close pals. We talk together on FaceTime all the time. And get next to Bob if you want to hear some stories too.
Yeah, I remember I met Bob when he was playing with Mel Lewis back in the late 70s before he went to Europe, and I was impressed by him personally and his playing as well. Ben, we're coming to the end of this extravaganza. Do you have any projects you'd like to discuss before we jump out here? Anything happening that you want people to know about right now?
Yes, I want them to know about this digital EP based on Who's the Old Guy Now. We're just about to launch it. And these days, when you launch a project, it's essentially digital, although, we manufactured CDs to send to radio, for radio. It's released in Europe. It's released in France. It's going to be released in Spain. And it's 5 new songs along the lines of Who's the Old Guy Now, which you open this program with. It's me and Leo, my man Leo, in a studio during the COVID pandemic. And during the pandemic, I finally got to do what I was trying to do for a long time, was just get in there with Leo and not anybody else and see what would come out of it. And that's this new project, which I truly, truly like. And if people are interested, the title is "Who's the Old Guy Now?"
All right. Well, I want to thank Ben Sidran for joining us today. We burned through an hour very quickly because, as you can see and hear, Ben has a lot to say, and he has a way of saying that brings us in. And hopefully, we can come back sometime. Next week, my guest will be the jazz detective, Zev Feldman, who goes and finds recordings that have never been released before, and they usually come out on LA-based Renaissance Records. I'm going to say goodbye. We're going to listen to watch one more video from Ben called "I Might Be Wrong." So once again, big thanks to Ben Sidran, bensidran.com. Leo, I'm sorry we didn't get you in the mix here. Maybe next time. So everyone, please stay safe and keep listening to jazz.
C'était en direct sur TSF Jazz.
Now I might be wrong, but it sure seems to me the past ain't what it was, and the future ain't what it used to be. Everywhere I go, I hear people say, man, you should have been here yesterday. You should have been here before the fall. And now it's the price of everything and the value of nothing at all. Oh, I might be wrong, but I think those days are gone. The past ain't what it was. The future won't be here long. Now we're all just the sons of the Dharma bums, waiting in the water of the infinite flow. And every time you take a look, there's another dead guy in your address book. Where have all the good ones gone? Why did they leave us here to carry on? Oh, I might be wrong, but everywhere I go, them that knows don't talk, and them that talks don't know. If silence is the answer, what could the question be? I might be wrong, but that's how it seems to me. Now we're all just the sons of the Dharma bums, waiting in the water of the infinite flow. And every time you turn the page, another actor leaves the stage. Where have all the good ones gone? Why did they leave us here to carry on? I might be wrong, but everywhere I go, them that knows don't talk, and them that talks don't know. If silence is the answer, what could the question be? I might be wrong, but but that's how it seems to me. We watch as time passes, and then so do we. So do we. So do we. So